No god ever answered from this temple, and yet every powerful man in Athens once feared what waited inside. I did not come here seeking truth. I came because I was ordered to write. In the spring of the 83rd Olympiad, when the dust of the road still carried the scent of rain and crushed olives, the council summoned me before dawn. I was young, barely trusted with official records, known more for my careful hand than for my courage. That was why they chose me, a man who would observe, listen, and not ask questions aloud. "There is a sanctuary," one of them said, his voice low, almost embarrassed by the words, "that exists outside the civic rites. You will document its customs, nothing more." No name was given. None was needed. Everyone in the room understood which place he meant. The temple lay beyond the vineyards, past the last shrines where travelers left offerings to Hermes. It did not appear on public maps. No festivals were announced there. No hymns mentioned it. Yet senators, generals, magistrates, men who loudly honored Athena and Zeus were seen walking its path under moonless skies, cloaks drawn tight, faces hidden like criminals. At first light, I followed that same path. The land grew quieter the farther I walked. Cicadas faded. Birds avoided the low hill where the temple stood. Even the wind seemed to bend around it, leaving the air strangely still, heavy with the smell of old stone and burnt resin. The structure itself was unmistakably Greek, yet deeply unsettling. Doric columns rose in perfect proportion, but their surfaces were scarred, not by age, but by deliberate erosion, as if symbols had once been carved there and later scraped away. The marble was not the proud white of Apollo's temples, but a muted gray, streaked with ash-dark veins. No statue crowned the pediment. No relief told a story. It was a temple that refused to explain itself. At the entrance waited 3 priests. They wore no insignia of Olympus, no laurel, no animal skins. Their robes were plain undyed linen, bound with cords instead of belts. Each bore the look of men who slept poorly and listened too much. "You are the scribe," the eldest said, not as a question. Inside, the temperature dropped. The stone floor was cold beneath my sandals, and the scent hit me immediately: old incense, copper, and something faintly sour, like extinguished blood without the blood itself. The interior was bare, almost offensively so. No statue, no altar, only an open central space surrounded by a shallow circular trench filled with blackened ash. I lifted my stylus. "Do not write yet," the priest said. "First, you must understand what is not here." Days passed. I remained within the sanctuary, eating simple bread and figs, sleeping in a small chamber near the rear wall. Each day, visitors arrived quietly. Powerful men, familiar faces. They did not pray. They did not kneel. They stood in silence, listening as the priests recited passages from tablets older than any I had studied. The language troubled me. It was Greek, but fractured, filled with structures no longer used, words that felt heavier in the mouth, as if shaped in a time before poetry softened speech. When I asked where the texts came from, the answer was always the same: from before. Before what? They never said. On the 7th night, during the dark of the moon, I was finally allowed to write. The ritual began without announcement. Torches were lit, their smoke clinging to the ceiling like a low cloud. The ash circle was disturbed for the first time, smoothed carefully by bare hands. Water mixed with salt was poured slowly, hissing softly as it touched the stone. No god was invoked. Instead, the priest spoke of order, not as law, but as inevitability, of collapse, not as punishment, but as balance. The words unsettled the men listening. I could see it in their faces. These were not prayers meant to comfort. They were reminders meant to humble. Then came the phrase that chilled me. "The gods were named," the priest said, "because names make fear bearable." I felt my grip tighten on the stylus. Later that night, alone in my chamber, I realized something that made sleep impossible. The temple was not merely unofficial. It was heretical. Not because it worshipped another god, but because it suggested the gods themselves were secondary, effects, not causes. Masks placed over something older, faceless, and utterly indifferent. By morning, I understood why no statue stood at the center. You cannot sculpt what has no form. You cannot pray to what does not listen. And if the council truly grasped what was taught here, then this temple was not a sanctuary. It was a threat. By the 9th day, the temple no longer felt like a place of stone. It felt like a mind, ancient, quiet, and aware of being observed. I began to notice patterns in the visitors. They never came on the same day of the civic calendar. They arrived according to a different reckoning, one the priests tracked not by festivals or Olympiads, but by shadows, tides, and the slow migration of stars. Men who governed Athens by daylight submitted themselves here to something that cared nothing for the city, its laws, or its gods. They listened. That alone was disturbing. In every other sanctuary I had studied, men spoke to beg, to thank, to bargain. Here, speech was dangerous. Silence was discipline. The priests warned that asking the wrong question could fracture the ritual, though they never explained how or why. One evening, as the torches were being extinguished, I asked the youngest priest a question I had held back for days. "If this place honors no god," I said carefully, "why does the council allow it to exist?" He did not answer immediately. He knelt and pressed his palm to the stone floor, as if listening through it. "Because it existed before them," he said at last, "and because destroying it requires admitting it was never theirs to judge." That night, I was permitted to read a fragment of the older tablets. They were not hymns. They were not myths. They were observations. Descriptions of cycles repeating long before the names Zeus or Hera were carved into stone. Accounts of civilizations rising, collapsing, and being forgotten, not as tragedies, but as natural corrections. The tablets spoke of the gods as interfaces, faces created by men to negotiate with forces too vast and indifferent to notice individual lives. One passage stood out, etched so deeply the stone had cracked around it. "When men grow afraid of silence, they invent voices." I understood then why this doctrine was hidden. It did not deny the gods outright. That would have been forgivable. It reduced them to stories, to tools. Athens could tolerate blasphemy. It could not tolerate irrelevance. As days passed, the rituals grew more complex. Chalk markings appeared briefly on the floor, erased before dawn. Bowls of oil were placed at precise angles, reflecting torchlight in deliberate patterns. The priests spoke less, but when they did, their words were sharper, stripped of comfort. One ritual focused entirely on memory. A visiting magistrate was instructed to recount his earliest fear. Not a heroic tale, not a noble failure. Something small and private. His voice shook as he spoke of being lost as a child, of calling out and hearing nothing answer. The priest nodded. "That silence," he said, "is closer to truth than any prayer." The man left before dawn, his face hollowed, his certainty gone. Soon after, rumors reached the city. Whispers that certain counselors had begun questioning public rights, that sacrifices felt performative, that oracles no longer satisfied them. The priests of Athena grew uneasy. The temple's influence, though unseen, was spreading like a stain beneath polished marble. I realized then that my presence here was not neutral. I was a witness, and witnesses are dangerous. One afternoon, a delegation arrived, unannounced men bearing the insignia of civic authority, escorted by hoplites who waited outside the sacred boundary. Visibly uncomfortable, the priests received them without ceremony. Their leader spoke plainly. "This place undermines order," he said. "Not by force, by doubt." The eldest priest replied just as plainly. "Order that cannot survive. Doubt is already broken." There was no shouting, no threats, only a long, suffocating silence. That night, the central ritual was altered. The ash circle was widened. The opening in the ceiling was uncovered completely, revealing a sky stripped of moon and stars, swallowed by cloud. The priests instructed all present, including me, to stand at equal distance from the center. "No names," the eldest warned. "No prayers. No expectations." The air grew dense, pressing against my chest. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, of the sound it made in the quiet. The stone beneath my feet felt almost warm. Then the priest spoke words I had never heard before. Not Greek, Not any language. The sound was low, rhythmic, almost mathematical. It did not echo. It absorbed. Nothing appeared. And yet every man there felt it, the sensation of being observed by something that did not care we were observing it in return. Not hostility, not judgment, indifference. One man fell to his knees, not in worship, but in panic. Afterward, no one spoke. The visitors left before dawn, some trembling, others eerily calm. The priests extinguished the torches and covered the opening above. I did not sleep. By morning, I knew the council's decision had already been made. A structure that teaches men the gods are optional cannot be allowed to stand, and a scribe who understands why cannot be allowed to speak. The first sign was absence, not arrests, not proclamations, just men who stopped coming. 2 magistrates failed to appear at the new moon ritual. A general sent a servant with a vague apology. A philosopher who had listened most intently to the priests was suddenly traveling, though no one could say where. Athens had not yet moved against the temple, but it had begun to erase its influence quietly, the way the city always did when it wished to pretend something had never mattered. Inside the sanctuary, the priests sensed the shift immediately. They spoke even less. Meals were shorter. The ash circle was never left unattended. At night, I heard murmured debates echoing through the stone corridors, arguments not about doctrine, but about time. "How long?" one voice asked. "As long as silence remains possible," another replied. I continued to write, though my records grew increasingly coded. Names vanished from my tablets, replaced by symbols. Dates became approximations. I knew that if my writings were ever seized, clarity would be dangerous. One morning, I was summoned to the inner chamber, an area previously forbidden to me. The room was narrow, its ceiling low, its walls unadorned except for faint etchings barely visible in torchlight. Unlike the main hall, this space smelled sharply of oil and old parchment. At its center rested a stone table, and upon it lay 3 tablets darker than the rest, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of hands. "These are not copies," the eldest priest said. "They are originals." I ran my fingers just above the stone, afraid to touch it. The tablets did not describe rituals. They described discoveries. Long before the Olympian gods had been named, before temples rose across the Aegean, there had been watchers, men who tracked patterns not in myths, but in time itself. They observed that civilizations rose in predictable arcs, that belief systems hardened, collapsed, and were replaced, that gods multiplied as fear intensified. The most dangerous conclusion came last. When a society invents gods to stabilize itself, it delays collapse, but deepens it. I looked up. "You believe the gods are a symptom," I said. The priest corrected me gently. "No, we believe they are an adaptation." Outside, thunder rolled across distant hills, though the sky above the temple remained clear. That afternoon, an official decree was posted in the agora. It did not mention the temple. Instead, it announced a renewed emphasis on traditional rites. Attendance at public sacrifices was strongly encouraged. New funds were allocated for statues, festivals, processions. The city was reminding itself who it was supposed to be. The priests of Athena began preaching against nameless philosophies. Oracles spoke of disorder disguised as wisdom. The word impiety re-entered public speech. At night, I dreamed of the temple standing alone, surrounded by statues that slowly turned their backs to it. The priests knew what was coming. They did not prepare defenses. They prepared memory. Scrolls were burned deliberately. Their ashes mixed into the central circle. Tablets were broken, fragments distributed among trusted hands. The doctrine was being scattered, not destroyed, seeded rather than preserved. "You cannot protect the truth by guarding it," the youngest priest told me. "Only by letting it change." I was given a choice: leave with what I had already written, or stay and share the temple's fate. I hesitated. Not because I feared death, because I feared survival with understanding. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed outside the sanctuary, not the measured steps of pilgrims, the disciplined march of men trained for order. Hoplitic sandals scraped against stone. The priests extinguished the torches. No resistance. the eldest whispered. No names. The doors did not burst open. They were opened carefully, almost respectfully. Civic officers entered, followed by men carrying sealed orders. Their leader's gaze swept the hall, pausing on the empty center, the absence that defined the space. So this is it, he said. A temple to nothing. The priest met his eyes. To what remains when names fail? The officer gestured toward me. The scribe comes with us. My heart sank not from fear, but from certainty. As they led me away, I looked back, one last time. The temple stood silent, unchanged, unafraid, as if it had always known this moment would come. They did not take me to a prison. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Instead, I was led through familiar streets, past temples bright with offerings, past statues freshly washed and garlanded, until we reached a civic building used for records and audits. A place of ink, not chains. The city understood the power of words better than the power of blades. Inside, the air smelled of wax and papyrus. The room they placed me in was small, windowless, lit by a single oil lamp. 3 men waited, not soldiers, not priests, administrators, the kind of men who ended conflicts by adjusting language. You are not accused, the eldest said calmly. You are being corrected. They laid my tablets on the table between us. What you observed, another continued, was not a temple. It was a private philosophical gathering that exceeded its boundaries. I said nothing. You will revise your account, the first man said. You will describe an abandoned structure briefly used by eccentrics. No doctrine, no rituals, no implication of antiquity. I finally spoke. And if I refuse? They exchanged glances, not angry, not threatening, almost sympathetic. Then your work will be revised without you, one replied. And you will discover how easy it is to be forgotten. They questioned me for hours, not about theology, but about influence. Who attended? Who listened too closely? Which men left changed? They were less afraid of the temple than of what it did to certainty. At one point, they asked me directly, "Did you see a god?" No, I answered truthfully. Relief flickered across their faces. Good, the eldest said. Then we agree it was nothing. I was released before nightfall. The next day, the temple was sealed. Officially, it was for safety structural instability, they claimed. Workers erected barriers. Priests of Athena performed purification rites in the surrounding land as if disinfecting a wound. Within weeks, maps were revised. The path leading to the hill was no longer marked. Public memory adjusted quickly. Athenians repeated what they were told. The structure became an unfinished shrine, then a failed project, then nothing at all. Only I remembered the weight of the silence inside. I tried to return. The hill was empty, not ruined, not collapsed, gone. Stone dismantled cleanly, columns removed without leaving debris. It was as if the temple had been lifted out of the earth with deliberate care. Vines already crept over disturbed soil, eager to cooperate with forgetting. That night, a knock came at my door. It was the youngest priest. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were calm. They spared you, he said. That means you're useful. He handed me a small fragment of stone wrapped in cloth, ash dark, etched with a single line. Silence predates belief. They didn't destroy everything, he continued. They can't. What this place taught cannot be unlearned. It can only be buried. Why give this to me? I asked. Because you know how to hide things in plain sight, he said. And because history trusts scribes more than priests. He left before I could respond. In the weeks that followed, Athens grew louder. Festivals intensified, sacrifices increased, statues multiplied. The city covered its unease with devotion, as if noise could drown out what had been heard in silence. But something had shifted. Men began to question oracles privately. Philosophers spoke cautiously of forces older than the gods. Students listened with unfamiliar skepticism. The doctrine of the nameless temple had not survived intact, but it had fractured into ideas, impossible to trace, impossible to fully suppress. I rewrote my official account. It was safe, boring, accurate enough to pass. But hidden within it, encoded in margins and phrasing, were patterns, repetitions, silences, traces that another careful reader might one day notice. The temple no longer existed, but its absence had weight. And I understood then the final danger it posed. Not that it denied the gods, but that once you glimpse a world where the gods are not central, you cannot place them back where they once stood. Years passed. Athens endured, as cities always do, through repetition, through ritual, through the comforting illusion of permanence. Wars flared and cooled. Leaders rose and fell. Temples were rebuilt, repaired, rededicated. To any outsider, nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, the city thought differently. I saw it in the questions students asked, not openly, not boldly, but sideways, as if testing the edges of permitted thought. I heard it in the silences that followed prayers, moments longer than tradition allowed. I noticed it in philosophers who began their arguments not with the gods, but with patterns. They never cited the temple. They didn't need to. Ideas, once released, rarely remember where they came from. I became older, more careful. My reputation grew not for brilliance but for accuracy. Men trusted my records. That trust allowed me to hide what mattered most. The fragment of stone remained concealed beneath the floor of my study. I never displayed it, never read it aloud. Its power was not in the words, but in the reminder they carried. Silence predates belief. One evening, a young student visited me. He claimed to be researching early civic structures, abandoned shrines, incomplete projects. His questions were precise, too precise. "There are references," he said, "to a building that does not fit known dedications. It appears, then vanishes." I studied his face carefully. "You should be cautious," I warned. "Athens has little patience for unfinished narratives." He smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it is the unfinished ones that matter most." He left before I could answer. Years later, I heard his name again. He was among those accused of impiety, not for denying the gods, but for questioning their necessity. As his trial unfolded, I recognized the pattern. The same fear, the same administrative language, the same insistence that doubt was disorder. History was repeating itself just as the tablets had predicted. I understood then that the temple had not failed. It had succeeded precisely because it was destroyed. Had it remained standing, it would have become a target, a doctrine, a rival. By vanishing, it became something more dangerous, a possibility. During a period of exile imposed for unrelated political reasons, I traveled beyond Attica. In other cities, I heard echoes. In Ionia, philosophers spoke of impersonal principles governing the cosmos. In distant lands, traders whispered of beliefs without faces, forces without names. Different words, same absence. One night, far from home, I dreamed of the temple again, not as it was, but as it would be remembered. Not a ruin, not a myth, but a question carved into time. What if the gods were not the beginning? When I returned to Athens, I buried the stone fragment deeper, beneath layers of revised manuscripts and approved histories. If it were ever found, it would seem meaningless, just another artifact stripped of context. That was the temple's final lesson. Meaning is fragile, context is power, and silence, true silence, outlasts both. Old age does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates in the hands, first in the slight tremor when holding a stylus, in the slower pace of thought, in the way memory begins to feel less like a record and more like a landscape you must navigate carefully. By the time I realized how much of my life had been shaped by the nameless temple, Athens itself had already become a different city. New gods arrived quietly, not carved from marble, but imported through trade, conquest, and curiosity. Foreign rites appeared at the margins, tolerated at first, then cautiously absorbed. Each came with names, stories, and promises. Each was greeted with both devotion and suspicion. I watched this with a strange detachment because I knew the pattern. The tablets had spoken of this too, not gods replacing gods, but layers forming. Each belief system stacking itself atop the last, never truly erasing what came before. The temple's doctrine did not oppose this. It explained it. Belief, it taught, was adaptive. When fear changed, so did the gods. In my later years, I was invited ironically to advise on archival reforms. The city wanted to preserve its history more efficiently, to protect itself from misinterpretation. They trusted me to decide what mattered. They did not realize how dangerous that trust was. I categorized documents. I consolidated accounts. I removed redundancies. Officially, I was strengthening memory. In truth, I was shaping absence. Certain references were quietly grouped together under vague headings. Dates were aligned in ways that blurred causality. A temple without a name became an anomaly, then a footnote, then a misattribution. No lies were written, only connections removed. One afternoon, while reviewing a shipment of recovered artifacts, I found something unexpected. A broken tablet fragment, dark with age, etched in a hand I recognized instantly. The same angular precision. The same economy of language. Someone else had preserved a piece. I felt a sudden, irrational fear, not of discovery, but of completion. The doctrine was never meant to be whole again. A complete truth invites opposition. A fragmented one spreads unnoticed. I ensured the fragment was cataloged incorrectly, its origin mislabeled, its significance diluted. Even preservation could be a form of concealment. That night, I walked alone to the hill where the temple had once stood. Nothing marked the place. Grass moved gently in the wind. Insects sang. The sky was indifferent. And yet, standing there, I felt the same pressure in my chest I had felt during the final ritual. The sensation of being observed not by a god, but by time itself. I understood then what the temple had truly been. Not a rebellion, not a heresy, a rehearsal, a space where men could experience a universe that did not center them and survive the realization. Most could not. Some could. Those who could carried the idea forward, not as doctrine, but as restraint, as skepticism, as the quiet refusal to fill every silence with a voice. I sat on the earth until night fell. I thought of all the temples still standing, brilliant and named. I thought of the one that had vanished without leaving even a ruin. And I realized something the priests had never said aloud. The most powerful belief is not the one that demands worship. It is the one that teaches you how to live without certainty. There came a moment quiet, unannounced, when I realized I was no longer preserving the past. I was guarding the future. It began with a request from beyond Athens. A scholar from the Western colonies, young and ambitious, sought access to early civic archives. His letter was respectful, carefully worded, and deeply unsettling. He was not looking for gods. He was looking for structures without dedications. Places that existed, then vanished. He had noticed the pattern. I delayed my response for weeks. Time, I had learned, was often the safest barrier. But delay only sharpens curiosity. When he arrived in person, there was no mistaking his intent. "You were present," he said, not accusing, not pleading. "You saw something no one else recorded." I did not deny it. He spoke excitedly of synthesis, of gathering fragments, aligning philosophies, tracing the evolution of belief itself. He believed he could reconstruct the doctrine, give it coherence, restore what had been lost. I felt genuine fear. "You don't understand," I told him. "Completion is exposure." He frowned. "Truth deserves clarity." "No," I replied. "Truth survives through ambiguity." I refused him access. Days later, I learned he had spoken publicly. Not recklessly, but passionately. He proposed that the gods might be cultural responses to deeper, impersonal principles. He framed it as scholarship, not sacrilege. The reaction was immediate. Debate hardened into accusation, accusation into threat. The city had learned nothing from the temple's erasure except how to repeat it more efficiently. I intervened quietly. Using my authority, I redirected scrutiny. I reframed his work as derivative, speculative, unoriginal. I diluted its novelty until it no longer frightened anyone. His career stalled. His ideas faded into obscurity. I hated myself for it, but I knew the alternative. Had his work gained traction, the doctrine would have acquired a name, a following, opponents, martyrs. It would have become exactly what the temple was designed to avoid, a belief. That night, I dreamed again. The temple stood restored not in stone, but in words. Scrolls lined its walls. Names were carved where silence had once been. Worshippers argued over interpretations. The center was no longer empty. I woke in dread. The next morning, I burned several of my own private notes. Not because they were false, but because they were too clear. Clarity invites conquest. As years passed, others came close. Philosophers circled the idea without landing on it. Mystics brushed against it and recoiled. Each time the doctrine bent, fragmented, survived. I began to see myself differently, not as a guardian of truth, but as a counterweight. A necessary friction against humanity's instinct to finalize, to conclude, to declare. The temple had taught that certainty was a luxury the universe did not afford. My task was to ensure that lesson remained uncomfortable, incomplete, and therefore alive. Began this account believing I would outlive the danger. I was wrong. Age does not only weaken the body, it loosens the grip one has on secrecy. Others begin to speak for you, to interpret your silences, to assemble patterns you no longer have the strength to scatter. It was my students who worried me most. They revered me. That reverence was dangerous. They quoted my phrasing. They analyzed my omissions. They treated my marginal notes as deliberate puzzles rather than the defensive habits they were. Slowly, without realizing it, they began assembling a shape where I had tried to leave only fragments. One evening, as I lay ill, 3 of them came together. Respectful, careful, certain. "We think we understand," one said. I closed my eyes. "Then you understand nothing," I replied. They spoke of a proto-philosophy, of pre-theistic frameworks, of a structural force underlying myth. They used gentle language, academic language. But the center of their reconstruction was unmistakable, the nameless principle. They wanted my confirmation. I gave them none. Instead, I told them a story. I described a temple that had never existed, a scribe who misinterpreted silence, a city that overreacted to nothing. I spoke calmly, convincingly. By the end, they were unsure whether the doctrine had ever been real or merely a projection imposed by later minds. Confusion, once planted, grows well. After they left, I hid the last remaining fragment, the ash-dark stone, inside a sealed jar, beneath the foundation of my home. Not for preservation, for delay. Someone might find it one day, or not. Either outcome would be acceptable. What mattered was that no single generation could claim ownership of the idea. No authority could finalize it. No name could stabilize it. As my strength faded, I reflected on the irony. The temple had been built to honor something older than gods, and it had succeeded only by being forgotten. That is the fate of all dangerous truths. Those that survive intact are harmless. Those that endure do so by dissolving. I was no longer afraid of death. I was afraid of closure. I lived long enough to see my own city forget me. Not entirely, of course. Names linger in records, in whispered citations, in marginal notes. But the truth, the dangerous, unnameable core was slipping beyond grasp, just as the priests had intended. I had become a ghost in my own lifetime, a curator of absence, and perhaps that was the greatest survival any idea could hope for. To persist, unseen, unnamed, intangible. It was during the final years of my life that I began to understand fully what the temple had taught, not in lessons or tablets, but in the lived tension between knowledge and ignorance. The most profound truths are those that cannot be held tightly, only glimpsed through cracks in the familiar. And the temple, built for a god that never existed, had created precisely such a crack, a place where men could see the machinery of belief without needing to touch it. I walked the hills outside Athens less frequently now. The path to the former temple site was overgrown, reclaimed by grass and stone and silence. Yet sometimes, at dusk, I would feel a pull, a subtle pressure in the chest, a faint vibration in the air that reminded me that the temple, in its absence, was still present. It had not vanished. It had merely withdrawn to a deeper layer of the world, the kind that does not need walls, columns, or names to endure. I began writing a final account, not for publication, not for memory, not even for posterity. I wrote for the principle itself. Carefully, I encoded lessons in tone, in omission, in cadence, in the spaces between words. Every paragraph carried two meanings, one obvious, one invisible. Only a reader willing to notice the silences, the pauses, the deliberate gaps would begin to understand what had once existed. The city continued its usual rituals: festivals, sacrifices, processions. Statues gleamed in the sun, and children learned the stories of gods with grand voices and moral lessons. No one remembered the temple. No one knew its doctrines, its teachings, or the men who once worshipped in silence. And yet, the principles it represented had seeped into thought like water through cracks in stone. A whisper here, a doubt there, a hesitation at the edges of certainty. On my final night, I dreamed again. I saw the temple fully restored, not as stone, but as experience. The ash circle gleamed under torchlight. The roof opening revealed a sky without stars, infinite and impartial. Men of all ages and ranks stood in the central space, not praying, not invoking, not fearing. They simply listened. And in that listening, they understood. The absence of a god does not mean absence of meaning. It means opportunity. I awoke with a sense of peace. My role was complete. The temple had outlasted me. It would continue, not as a building or a cult, but as an idea that could not be owned, that could not be fully understood, that could never be declared safe. Its survival depended on its elusiveness, its impermanence, its refusal to be named. And that, I realized, is the lesson of all dangerous truths. They thrive not by being captured, but by slipping quietly into the shadows of human thought. I set down my stylus one final time. The manuscripts were secure, their lessons hidden, the fragments of stone, the ash, the marginal annotations all carefully concealed. The city slept, unaware of the currents flowing beneath its streets and hills. And the temple, godless and silent, endured. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of memory. By the time I drew my last breath, Athens was unrecognizable in ways both large and small. Temples had multiplied, statues gleamed brighter, and the names of gods echoed with a confidence that had not existed in my youth. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm of civic life, a quieter current persisted, a shadow of the nameless temple, moving invisibly through thought, language, and imagination. I am gone. The manuscripts I left behind are preserved, catalogued, but largely unread. Scholars may stumble across them centuries later and marvel at the stylistic peculiarities, the odd omissions, the strange, deliberate silences. Few will suspect their purpose. Fewer still will perceive the encoded lessons I tried to embed, that certainty is a fragile construct, that authority thrives on the illusion of completeness, and that the most powerful truths are those which evade possession. The temple itself exists now only as possibility. Its stones have vanished, scattered, reused, or simply absorbed back into the earth. No ruin marks its place. No city record names it. And yet, it continues to exist in the spaces where doubt meets observation, in the silent acknowledgement that what we call gods, principles, or laws may sometimes be nothing more than carefully curated patterns of human imagination. I imagine a traveler, curious, careful, patient, finding a fragment of ash-dark stone, or a margin note buried in a manuscript, and pausing. Perhaps, in that pause, the idea will awaken again. It will not be worshipped. It will not command. It will simply exist as a question, a hesitation, a space in which a person realizes that some forces, some truths, cannot be fully named, fully known, or fully controlled. That, I think, is the enduring power of the nameless temple. Not in what it contained, but in what it refused to give. Not in its rituals, its priests, or even its doctrines, but in the deliberate emptiness at its heart. And so it survives, silent, godless, eternal in its absence. Even as I fade from memory, I take solace in knowing that what cannot be possessed cannot be destroyed. The temple was never mine. It was never anyone's. It belonged only to the fragile balance between knowing and unknowing, between fear and acceptance, between presence and absence. To future generations who may stumble across traces of it if they are cautious, observant, and patient, they will feel the weight of silence. They may not name it, they may not even describe it, but they will know, in that ungraspable way that ideas sometimes convey themselves, that something beyond gods, beyond ritual, beyond the certainty of stone, exists. And in that knowing, they will carry forward the temple's greatest lesson, that the most profound truths survive not by being seen or spoken, but by enduring quietly, invisibly, in the spaces between certainty and doubt. The temple, built for a God that never existed, endures. It always has. It always will.